The Fed says, don't worry, we will deftly manage this whole process. But anybody who's looked at the record of the Fed in the last 10 years will not have any confidence. Bernanke was making predictions like, don't worry, we have the subprime mortgage problem contained, don't worry about it, when it was blowing up. So I think the result of all this is that there is not much confidence that this will be handled in a stable and smooth way. But this just shows you the inflation forecast, which suggests that at least through 2011, it's going to remain very contained. This is a global crisis, and the issue of global imbalances has risen to the fore. A major source of global imbalances, of course, is focus as being China. And that's been the source of a lot of tension between the United States and China. Well, first, one should observe that the global imbalances, the fact that part of the world is exporting much more than it's consuming, and part of the world, namely the United States, is consuming much more than it's producing. The global imbalances did not cause this last crisis, but they are a source of concern because they could cause the next, that at some point there will be could be a disorderly unwinding, and that would be very disturbing. These global imbalances remain large. The G20 proposal are not likely to be effective. What the G20 proposed was for the U.S. to save more and for China to consume more. Now, I think it is imperative that the U.S. will save more. But I don't think we should be encouraging China to consume more. The world cannot survive if everyone consumes at America's profligate style. What is needed is more investment, for instance, for retrofitting for global warming and helping address global poverty. So the key challenge going forward is how to take the savings of China and use it for constructive purposes rather than the way it was wasted before. And that's really a question of the financial sector and its failure. Well, this just shows you a little bit of the picture of these global imbalances, and what you see very strongly in this, is that the major imbalance is, on the one side, the U.S. deficit, but on the other side, what should be also clear is that Germany's surplus is a major contributor to global imbalances. In fact, as a percentage of GDP, Germany's surplus is greater than China's. So if you think that China's surplus causes an imbalance in a global sense, Germany's surplus creates an imbalance within the European context, and Germany is really part of the problem, and that's where more of the burden of adjustment needs to be placed. The fifth question is, will there be global financial regulatory reform? I'll come back to this a little bit later, but just to give you a brief answer now, the U.S. is likely to pass a light version of the bill that was reported from the Senate, which is not enough for an adequate long-run solution. But right now, in the last 2 weeks, things have changed very dramatically in our Congress. Prospects for a strong bill have increased dramatically, reasons that have to do with American politics. One of the things I've increasingly become convinced is that while global coordination is very important, it's going to be very difficult to achieve, and the focus at this juncture ought to be more on protecting our economies and our citizens from the abuses of the past. How worried do we need to be about trade tensions? They've increased markedly between China and the U.S. It's not the real economic issue. Adjusting the exchange rate will not have a significant effect for instance, on the U.S. multilateral trade deficit that I showed in the previous chart. But in many ways, the tensions are not a surprise. The fact is that fiscal policy, I mentioned before, the stimulus is coming to an end because of the constraints on the deficits. Monetary policy has reached its limits. You can't go lower than 0 interest rates. And that means what is going to be focused on is protectionism. And so unless something is done, I think there is a real risk of growing protectionism. And finally, where are we on global warming? This is an economic issue, not just an environmental issue. Copenhagen was, in my judgment, a failure. The key failure was the inability to devise an approach to sharing the burden, and the alternative approaches were not adequately explored. And unfortunately, there was little progress in a number of the other key issues. But the reason it's an important economic issue is, had we had a good reform that would have raised the price of carbon emissions, it would have provided incentives for firms to do more green investment. And that would have been a spur for investment that would have helped the economies get out of the current downturn. As it is, the failure to do anything has increased uncertainty, and uncertainty tends to diminish investment. So it's had a counterproductive effect. Well, there are 2 big issues going forward. One is regulatory reform, and the second is macroeconomic policy. And let me just very quickly go through that and open it up to questions then. Going forward on regulatory reform, there are 5 issues: transparency, incentives, structure, behavior, and products. In many ways, things today are worse than they were before the crisis. And I'll try to explain why that is. For instance, on transparency, there had been before a move to what is called mark-to-market accounting, so you could see what the value of the assets inside a bank was. Well, when this accounting showed that the banks had made many bad loans, what did the banks say? Let's change the accounting system. And they succeeded. They intervened in the independent accounting agency, put enormous pressure, and the result of that was we allow banks in the United States to keep on their books even mortgages that are not paying, as if they were paying. They said, don't worry, maybe they will pay in 20 years if we keep praying enough. The result of that is that we have even now a less sense of where the real structure of the financial system is. The second issue is incentives. And as I mentioned before, bad incentives played a very big role in the crisis. And again, too little is being done to change those incentives. A little bit more discussion in Europe than in the United States. But it's both individual and organizational. The real problem is structure. Too big to fail banks. Being too big to fail provides bad incentives. Now, the problem is that things have gotten worse in the structure. I mentioned before that we bailed out the too big to fail banks. We've led the too big to fail banks to get even bigger. We increased concentration. And we increased the moral hazard problems because not only did we bail out the banks, but we bailed out the bankers, the shareholders, and the bondholders. And so we have actually made the problem much worse.